If you walk through the financial district of Tokyo today, you will see monuments to Japan's economic miracle. You will see the gleaming towers of Mitsubishi and Sony, the headquarters of Toyota and Honda. You will see the Nikkei Stock Exchange, still one of the largest in the world. The story we tell ourselves about Japan's rise and fall is a comfortable one. We are taught that Japan became rich through hard work and innovation. We are taught that the Japanese economic bubble of the 1980s was the result of irrational speculation and bad banking. We are taught that when the bubble burst in 1990, it was a natural correction, a painful but necessary market adjustment. The Japanese call the decades that followed the lost years a period of stagnation and deflation from which the country has never fully recovered. But there is a different version of this story. It is a version that you will not find in the economics textbooks of Harvard or the London School of Economics. It is a version that is remembered with bitterness in the boardrooms of Tokyo and whispered about in the private clubs of the Japanese elite. In this version of the story, Japan did not collapse because of its own mistakes. Japan was assassinated. It was killed by its closest ally, the United States of America, in a coordinated financial strike that was as devastating as any military attack. The weapon was not a bomb or a missile. It was a piece of paper signed in a hotel in New York City. It was called the Plaza Accord. This is the story of how the American government, terrified of being overtaken by a former enemy, conspired with European powers to destroy the Japanese economy. It is the story of how currency manipulation was used as a tool of economic warfare. It is the story of how a nation that had built itself from the ashes of World War II into the second largest economy on earth was brought to its knees by the stroke of a pen. And it challenges the myth of free market capitalism, revealing the cold geopolitical calculus that governs the global financial system. To understand this assassination, we have to go back to the early 1980s and understand the terror that gripped the American establishment. By 1985, Japan was not just rich, it was winning. The Japanese economy had been growing at an average rate of 10% per year for 3 decades. This was unprecedented in modern history. A nation that had been carpet-bombed into rubble in 1945 had rebuilt itself into an industrial superpower that was outcompeting the United States in almost every sector that mattered. Japanese cars were dominating American roads. Honda and Toyota were selling millions of vehicles in the United States, while Ford and General Motors were hemorrhaging market share. Japanese electronics were crushing American brands. Sony Walkman players were in every teenager's pocket. Panasonic televisions were in every American living room. RCA and Zenith, the great American electronics companies, were being driven out of business. Japanese steel was flooding American markets, undercutting domestic producers and shutting down the factories of Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana. The Rust Belt was rusting because of Japan, but it was not just about consumer goods. Japan was winning the technology race. Japanese companies were leading the world in semiconductor production, robotics, and advanced manufacturing techniques. The Japanese model of lean production and just-in-time inventory was being studied in every business school in America. Management gurus were telling American CEOs that if they did not learn from Japan, they would die. The fear in Washington was existential. American policymakers looked at the trajectory and saw a future where Japan would overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Some projections suggested this could happen by the year 2000. This was not just an economic threat, it was a psychological wound. The United States had defeated Japan in World War II. America had occupied Japan, written its constitution, and shaped its political system. Japan was supposed to be the grateful junior partner, the loyal ally in Asia. But now, the student was surpassing the master. American politicians began to use language that sounded eerily like the racist propaganda of the 1940s. They called Japan an economic Pearl Harbor. They described Japanese business practices as unfair, predatory, and un-American. There was a rising tide of Japan bashing in the media and in Congress. The crisis came to a head because of the trade deficit. In 1985, the United States was running a massive trade deficit with Japan. America was importing far more from Japan than it was exporting. The numbers were staggering. The bilateral trade deficit with Japan had reached $50 billion per year. This meant that tens of billions of dollars were flowing out of the United States and into Japan every single year. American workers were losing their jobs. American factories were closing, and the Japanese were using the profits to buy American assets. Japanese investors were buying up office buildings in Manhattan, hotels in Hawaii, and even iconic American landmarks like Rockefeller Center and Pebble Beach Golf Course. The humiliation was unbearable for the American elite, but the root cause of the trade imbalance was not just Japanese competitiveness. It was the exchange rate. The value of the Japanese yen relative to the American dollar was artificially low. This made Japanese goods incredibly cheap for American consumers and made American goods incredibly expensive for Japanese buyers. The exchange rate in the early 1980s was hovering around 250 yen to the dollar. This was a disaster for American exporters. Why was the yen so weak? Because the Japanese government was intervening in the currency markets to keep it that way. The Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance were buying dollars and selling yen to suppress the value of their currency. This was a deliberate policy to support Japanese exporters. It was a form of currency manipulation that gave Japan an unfair advantage. The Americans knew this. They had been complaining about it for years. But the Japanese refused to change course. They argued that the strong dollar was America's problem, not Japan's. They pointed out that the United States was running enormous budget deficits under President Ronald Reagan. The Reagan administration had cut taxes and increased military spending, creating a fiscal disaster that was sucking in foreign capital and inflating the dollar. This was true. The strong dollar was partly America's fault. But the Reagan administration did not care about economic theory. They cared about political survival. The Rust Belt states were bleeding jobs, and those states were crucial to Reagan's re-election prospects. The president needed a solution, and he needed it fast. His Treasury Secretary, James Baker, was tasked with finding a way to weaken the dollar and strengthen the yen without crashing the American economy or starting a trade war. Baker was a political operator, a man who understood power. He realized that the United States could not force Japan to change its policy through negotiation alone. Japan was too strong, too proud, and too dependent on its export model to give in willingly. So Baker decided to use leverage. He decided to turn America's allies against Japan. In the summer of 1985, Baker began a secret series of negotiations with the finance ministers of the world's major economies. He reached out to West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. He told them that the strong dollar was hurting their economies too. German and French exporters were also struggling to compete with American goods in third markets because of the inflated dollar. Baker proposed a coordinated intervention. He suggested that the world's major central banks should work together to drive down the value of the dollar and drive up the value of the yen and the Deutsche Mark. It was a conspiracy among the rich nations to gang up on the richest of them all. The Germans and the French were hesitant at first. They understood that this was a dangerous game. Currency markets are massive, and trying to manipulate them can have unpredictable consequences. But Baker sweetened the deal. He hinted that if they did not cooperate, the United States might resort to protectionism. He suggested that Congress might pass tariffs and trade barriers that would hurt European exporters just as much as Japanese ones. The Europeans realized they had no choice. If they did not help America, America would hurt them. So they agreed. On September 22, 1985, the finance ministers and central bank governors of 5 nations met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. It was a Sunday. The markets were closed. The meeting was secret. The attendees were the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. These were the 5 largest economies in the world, the G5. They gathered in a suite overlooking Central Park, and they made a decision that would reshape the global economy. The statement they released was bland and technical. It said that the ministers had agreed that exchange rates should better reflect fundamental economic conditions. It said that they would cooperate to achieve this goal. But the meaning was clear to anyone who understood the language of international finance. The G5 had declared war on the dollar. They had agreed to intervene in the currency markets to force the dollar down and the yen up. This was the Plaza Accord. It was presented to the world as a cooperative agreement, a multilateral effort to correct imbalances, but in reality, it was an ambush. Japan had been cornered. The Japanese finance minister, Noboru Takeshita, sat at that table and realized that he had been trapped. Takeshita was not a naive man. He knew what this agreement meant. A rapid appreciation of the yen would devastate Japanese exporters. It would make Sony televisions and Toyota cars more expensive for American buyers. It would wipe out the competitive advantage that Japan had built over decades. He protested. He argued that Japan should not be singled out. He pointed out that the strong dollar was America's fault, but James Baker made it clear. If Japan did not sign, the United States would impose trade sanctions. Congress was already drafting protectionist legislation. There were bills in the pipeline that would slap tariffs on Japanese cars and electronics. If those bills passed, Japan would lose access to the American market entirely. Takeshita had no choice. He signed the agreement. He returned to Tokyo and told the Japanese people that this was a victory for international cooperation. But privately, he knew the truth. Japan had been sacrificed on the altar of American economic nationalism. The intervention began immediately. In the days and weeks following the Plaza Accord, the central banks of the G5 nations began selling dollars and buying yen and Deutschmarks. They flooded the currency markets with coordinated sales. The impact was immediate and dramatic. The value of the dollar began to collapse. In September 1985, the exchange rate was 242 yen to the dollar. By the end of 1986, it had fallen to 160 yen to the dollar. By 1988, it had crashed to 120 yen to the dollar. In just 3 years, the yen had appreciated by more than 50% against the dollar. This was not a market correction. This was a controlled demolition. For Japanese exporters, it was a catastrophe. Imagine you are running a Japanese car company in 1985. You have built your business model around selling cars in America. You have calculated your profit margins based on an exchange rate of 240 yen to the dollar. Suddenly, within 2 years, that exchange rate is 160 yen to the dollar. Your profit margins have been cut by 1/3. You have 2 choices. You can raise your prices in America, which will make your cars uncompetitive. Or you can keep your prices the same and accept massive losses. Either way, you are bleeding. The Japanese business community panicked. The executives at Toyota, Honda, Sony, and Panasonic held emergency meetings. They looked at their balance sheets and realized that their export model was collapsing. They had to find a way to survive. Some companies tried to cut costs. They laid off workers. They reduced investments in research and development. They squeezed their suppliers, but there was a limit to how much they could cut. The appreciation of the yen was too rapid and too severe. Other companies tried to move production overseas. If they could not export from Japan, they would build factories in America and Europe. This is when Japanese companies began to invest heavily in manufacturing plants in the United States. Honda built a factory in Ohio. Nissan built a plant in Tennessee. This created some jobs for American workers, but it also meant that Japan was exporting capital instead of goods. The profits from those factories stayed in America. Japan was losing both ways. But the most destructive response came from the Japanese government. The Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance looked at the collapsing export sector and realized they had to do something to save the economy. If exports collapsed, Japan would fall into a recession. Unemployment would rise. The political system would destabilize. They decided to use the only tool they had left. They decided to stimulate the domestic economy with cheap money. The Bank of Japan began to lower interest rates. They dropped the benchmark interest rate from 5% in 1985 to 2.5% by 1987. The idea was simple. If Japanese companies could not make money by exporting, they would make money by selling to Japanese consumers. If the domestic economy was booming, it would compensate for the loss of exports. Cheap credit flooded the Japanese economy. Banks began lending money at incredibly low interest rates. Businesses could borrow for almost nothing. Consumers could take out loans to buy houses and cars with minimal interest payments. This was the spark that ignited the bubble. When money is cheap, people do not invest it in productive assets. They invest it in speculative assets. They buy stocks and real estate, hoping that the prices will go up. This is exactly what happened in Japan. Japanese investors, flush with cheap credit, began pouring money into the Tokyo stock market. The Nikkei stock index began to soar. In 1985, the Nikkei was at 13,000 points. By 1989, it had reached 38,915 points. It had tripled in just 4 years. This was insane. Stock prices were rising far faster than corporate earnings. Companies that were struggling because of the strong yen were seeing their stock prices skyrocket. It made no economic sense. But in a bubble, sense does not matter. Momentum matters. At the same time, real estate prices began to explode. Japanese investors began buying property in Tokyo, Osaka, and other major cities. Land prices rose so fast that it became the most valuable real estate in the world. At the peak of the bubble, the land underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. The grounds of the palace are about 1/4 square kilometers. People were calculating that this small plot of land was worth more than all the homes, farms, and businesses in the largest state in America. It was absurd, but the Japanese banks kept lending. They were lending based on the inflated value of collateral. If you owned land in Tokyo, you could borrow millions of yen against it because the bank believed the land would keep going up in value. And what did people do with those loans? They bought more land and more stocks. It was a feedback loop. Rising prices justified more lending drove prices higher. The Japanese people began to believe that they had discovered a new economic model. They believed that Japan was special, that Japanese real estate and Japanese stocks would never fall. There was a term for this, the Japanese miracle. Business magazines around the world ran cover stories about how Japan had perfected capitalism. Books were published with titles like Japan as #1. The Japanese elite were filled with hubris. They believed they had won. They believed they had surpassed America. In 1989, Japanese companies were the most valuable in the world. The top 10 companies by market capitalization were all Japanese. Nippon Telegraph, Sumitomo Bank, and Industrial Bank of Japan were worth more than Exxon, IBM, and General Electric. Japanese investors were buying trophy assets in the United States. They bought the Columbia Pictures movie studio. They bought the iconic Rockefeller Center in Manhattan. It seemed like Japan was buying America piece by piece. But in Washington and New York, the American establishment was watching with satisfaction. They knew what was coming. They knew that the bubble could not last. They knew that when it burst, Japan would be crippled. And they had a plan to make sure it burst at the right time. The trigger would be the same tool they had used to create the Plaza Accord, interest rates. By 1989, the American economy was recovering. The trade deficit with Japan had narrowed slightly because Japanese goods were now more expensive. American manufacturers were starting to compete again. The Federal Reserve, under Chairman Alan Greenspan, decided it was time to raise interest rates to prevent inflation in the United States. As American interest rates rose, capital began to flow out of Japan and back into the United States. Investors realized they could get better returns in America than in Tokyo. At the same time, the Bank of Japan realized that the bubble in Tokyo was getting out of control. Real estate prices were so high that ordinary Japanese families could no longer afford to buy homes. There was a growing public backlash. The central bank decided it had to act. In 1989, the Bank of Japan began to raise interest rates aggressively. They raised the benchmark rate from 2.5% to 6% in just 2 years. This was the pin that popped the bubble. When interest rates rise, borrowing becomes expensive. The cheap credit that had fueled the speculation dried up overnight. Suddenly, investors could not borrow more money to buy stocks and real estate. The demand collapsed. And when demand collapsed, prices began to fall. The Nikkei stock index peaked on December 29, 1989, at 38,915 points. Then it began to fall, slowly at first, then faster. By October 1990, the Nikkei had fallen to 20,000 points. It had lost half its value in less than a year. Investors who had borrowed money to buy stocks were wiped out. They owed more than their portfolios were worth. They were forced to sell, which pushed prices down further. It was a death spiral. Real estate prices followed the same trajectory. Land values in Tokyo began to plummet. The property that had been worth more than California was suddenly worth a fraction of that. People who had borrowed against their homes found themselves underwater. They owed more than their homes were worth. The Japanese banks, which had lent trillions of yen based on inflated collateral, were suddenly insolvent. Their balance sheets were filled with bad loans that would never be repaid. Companies that had borrowed to expand were now drowning in debt. Consumers who had taken out loans to speculate were bankrupt. The entire economy ground to a halt. This was the beginning of the lost decades. For the next 30 years, the Japanese economy would stagnate. Growth rates fell to less than 1% per year. Deflation set in. Prices for goods and services began to fall, which sounds good until you realize that it destroys the incentive to invest. Why buy a car today if it will be cheaper next year? Why build a factory today if you can build it for less tomorrow? Deflation is an economic cancer. The human cost was staggering. Unemployment rose. Lifetime employment, the cornerstone of the Japanese social contract, was shattered. Companies that had promised to employ their workers until retirement began laying off thousands. The suicide rate in Japan spiked. Middle-aged men who had dedicated their lives to their companies found themselves jobless and hopeless. The Japanese word karoshi, death from overwork, was joined by a new term, roshi, death from unemployment. An entire generation of young Japanese, the so-called lost generation, graduated into an economy with no jobs. They became freeters, part-time workers with no security and no future. Marriage rates collapsed. Birth rates fell off a cliff. The social fabric of Japan began to unravel. The Japanese government tried everything to restart the economy. They cut interest rates to zero. They engaged in massive public works spending, building roads and bridges to nowhere. They injected trillions of yen into the banking system to keep the banks from collapsing, but nothing worked. The damage was too deep. The bubble had destroyed trust. People stopped spending. Companies stopped investing. The economy was trapped in a liquidity trap where even free money could not stimulate demand. And all the while, the United States was booming. The 1990s were the golden age of the American economy. The tech boom, the dot-com bubble, the rise of Microsoft and Apple and Amazon. America was back on top. The threat from Japan had been neutralized. Was this a coincidence? Did the Plaza Accord cause the Japanese bubble and the subsequent collapse? Or was it just bad luck and bad policy by the Japanese authorities? The official story is that Japan made its own mistakes. That the Bank of Japan kept interest rates too low for too long. That Japanese banks were reckless. That the government failed to regulate speculation. All of this is true, but it ignores the underlying cause. Japan would never have lowered interest rates so aggressively if the Plaza Accord had not destroyed its export sector. The cheap money was a response to the currency appreciation forced by the United States. Some economists and historians have argued that the Plaza Accord was an act of economic warfare, that it was a deliberate strategy by the United States to kneecap its most dangerous competitor. There is evidence to support this view. Declassified documents from the Reagan administration show that American policymakers understood the risks of forcing the yen to appreciate. They knew it could trigger a bubble in Japan, but they decided the risk was worth it. The priority was to save American manufacturing and restore American economic dominance, even if it meant destroying Japan. James Baker, the architect of the Plaza Accord, later admitted in his memoirs that the agreement was designed to help American exporters. He did not express any regret about the consequences for Japan. In Tokyo, the Plaza Accord is remembered as a betrayal. The Japanese establishment, which had trusted the United States as an ally, felt that they had been stabbed in the back. The younger generation of Japanese policymakers learned a hard lesson. You cannot trust the Americans when your interests conflict with theirs. This bitterness has shaped Japanese foreign policy ever since. Japan has been far more cautious about economic integration with the United States. They have been more willing to pursue independent policies in Asia, and they have been quietly building relationships with other powers, including China, as a hedge against American dominance. The Plaza Accord also had global implications. It established a precedent. It showed that the United States could use coordinated currency intervention as a weapon. It showed that international agreements could be used to force weaker nations to sacrifice their economies for the benefit of the hegemon. This playbook has been used again and again. In the 1990s, the United States pressured Asian countries to liberalize their financial markets, which led to the Asian financial crisis of 1997. In the 2000s, the United States pressured China to appreciate its currency, which contributed to global imbalances that culminated in the 2008 financial crisis. The lesson is clear. The global financial system is not a level playing field. It is a rigged game where the rules are written by the powerful. The legacy of the Plaza Accord is still visible today. Japan has never fully recovered from the lost decades. The Nikkei stock index did not return to its 1989 peak until 2024, 35 years later. An entire generation of Japanese investors lost everything and never came back. The Japanese economy is now the fourth largest in the world, having been overtaken by China and Germany. The demographic crisis is worse than ever. Japan has one of the oldest populations in the world and one of the lowest birth rates. The country is shrinking. Towns and villages are being abandoned. There is a term for these places: ghost towns. The Japanese dream of overtaking the United States as the world's largest economy is dead. It died in 1985 in a hotel suite in New York City, but the most profound legacy is psychological. The Plaza Accord shattered the Japanese sense of invincibility. It destroyed the belief that hard work and innovation were enough to succeed in the global economy. It taught the Japanese people that the rules of the game can be changed at any moment by those who hold power. It taught them that an ally is only an ally as long as you are not a threat. The Chinese Communist Party has studied the Plaza Accord closely. They have looked at what happened to Japan, and they have vowed not to let it happen to China. This is why China has resisted American pressure to appreciate its currency. This is why China has capital controls that limit the flow of money in and out of the country. This is why China has built massive foreign exchange reserves, a war chest of over $3 trillion to defend its currency if necessary. The Chinese leaders remember the lesson of Japan. If you let the Americans manipulate your currency, they will destroy your economy. The Plaza Accord proves that the line between cooperation and coercion is thin. It proves that international agreements can be weapons disguised as diplomacy. It proves that in the world of global finance, there is no such thing as a free market. There are only managed markets, and the question is who does the managing. In 1985, the United States decided that it would manage the global economy to serve its own interests, and Japan paid the price. The Japanese economic miracle was not killed by bad luck or bad policy. It was assassinated by the country that claimed to be its closest friend, and the weapon was not a gun or a bomb. It was a signature on a piece of paper and a coordinated manipulation of the currency markets. The towers of Tokyo still gleam in the sunlight. The trains still run on time. The technology is still cutting edge. But beneath the surface, Japan is a nation that has been hollowed out. The vitality is gone. The ambition is gone. The belief that the future will be better than the past is gone. The Plaza Accord was not just an economic policy. It was a psychological trauma that severed the connection between effort and reward,